one of the difficulties that I see with interviews, taped interviews, is it's laid down once. Maybe it's edited, maybe it's not. Maybe you can come back and put another layer in or a follow-up question or whatever, but it's laid down once. An oral history is something that would be told repeatedly, and the recipient was active in the conversation by their silence and attention rather than engaged in the conversation by their attentiveness and question. So it's a different kind of learning, and if I was a young man, I would go in and go back and go into brain science, because I think that where things are kept may be different in the brain depending upon how the interactions are and what synapses fire. I mean, now we're off in stuff that I don't know anything about, so I shouldn't talk about it. But my point is that if Grandpa tells a story and grandson is in a situation and comes to Grandpa and sits at his feet and listens, Grandpa knows what the situation was with that younger and adapts the oral history in an effective way to instill the knowledge that needs to be instilled at that time with that person, audience, for that purpose. Grandson comes next year, having been out playing his cording flute, and Grandpa has a different story that's still the oral tradition, and it's tied to this boy with this name or whatever. I mean, I'm making this up to help you understand. But I think that oral tradition piece is hugely important, but it's flexible. And European history is not exactly that way. It's written by the dominant culture. And so I think that that's one of the challenges. And so the advantage of museums being partners with schools is that there does need to be some structure to learning so that Johnny and Sue can go off to the oil patch and work and stay in North Dakota. But there also needs to be some flexibility so that Sue can recognize that she can be a roughneck or whatever. I mean, so that I think that the ability that a museum can offer to, here's a different perspective, another way to look at things, is part of where that oral tradition comes from. It's a program rather than a tour. If I give you a tour, and I give you a tour, and I give you a tour, by the 10th one, you might as well run a tape. It's going to be the same tour. If I give you a program, I'm going to look at your plastic coffee cup today, and I'm going to look at your metal one tomorrow, and I'm going to look at something else the next day, and we'll still emphasize similar things, but it's going to be a different program because I've got an object, I have a strategy for connecting that, I know who my audience is, I know where my location is that I'm going to be doing it, and I know what my learning objectives are. That's the same thing that a teacher does in a classroom on an individual basis. And so, I mean, I think that we need to be in a partnership together, is to get to your answer. And your question about oral history just was so interesting. I went to a program by a winter count keeper a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the gathering that would happen in the spring of the year when the family would get together and talk about all the things that happened that year. All the things that happened that year. And the count keeper would listen. So it's coming in. As that conversation came to resolution or conclusion, he said, the count keeper and the group would decide what the image was going to be to go on the winter count. Well, the count keeper has that image that's stars falling. It's 1834. It's the great Pleiades. Mandans came into Maximilian at Fort Clark and told them about the sky was falling. I mean, the year the stars fell. It's all over the Northern Plains on every winter count. That's the story. But if a whole family sat together and talked about everything else that happened that year, and that's the one that gets chosen and that's the document, the winter count keeper has all the rest of those stories too that are attached to that image. The next year when they go back, the count keeper reviews the count with everybody and they talk about all of the stories around every one of those, and so it's a continuous history. It isn't just a dot on a calendar. I mean, and you think about winter counts that way, we look at them and it's like, oh, this was the year the sky fell. This was, whatever. No, it's all this other stuff, and this is the way I can remember it. And that is what you can do in a museum. So a teacher can come in with their class and they don't have to do the same thing every time. They can go in and move with it, and so it keeps them engaged, it keeps the students engaged, it keeps Johnny, who's coming at it from a very angry and doesn't know why he's there perspective, can be involved in a conversation in a different way because the teacher knows that I've got to deal with this behavior issue. Here's a way that I can do it because I'm familiar with what's here, and get Johnny looking at busting rock as a way of making a living 400 years ago or 4,000 years ago. And then Johnny's just acting out because he's frustrated, like I was as a kid. I was not necessarily your best student, but I think I did okay.